The legend of Ned Kelly was already carved into the history of Australia, but his story was far from over. After the daring hold-up at Euroa, the Kelly gang had tasted success, but they knew that to keep their fight alive, they had to strike again, bigger, bolder, and with a message that would shake the colony to its core. Their next target: the town of Jerilderie, where Ned would take his rebellion to a whole new level, not just with guns, but with words. What followed was a raid unlike any before, a declaration of defiance, and an escape that left the police humiliated once more. But even as the gang's infamy grew, so did the forces closing in on them. The final act of this outlaw saga was set to unfold in Glenrowan, a desperate last stand against impossible odds, where bullets and iron would decide their fate. Would Ned Kelly's armor make him invincible, or would it become the symbol of his downfall? This is the story of the Jerilderie Raid, the Glenrowan Siege, and the fate of Australia's most infamous bushranger. The Euroa Bank robbery did something remarkable for the image of the Kelly gang. Until then, the press had painted them as nothing more than bloodthirsty bushrangers, devoid of sympathy or honor. But the faithful Creek hostages told a very different story. The gang's civility, offering food, sharing jokes, and treating their captives with unexpected courtesy, became the talk of the colony. Even more astonishing was the Euroa Bank manager, Robert Scott, who went so far as to sing Ned Kelly's praises. To the Australian sketcher, he described Ned as a good-looking man, while telling the Herald that Kelly was a splendid specimen of the human kind, tall, active, rather handsome, with a reddish beard and hair. In those words, the making of a legend had begun. Meanwhile, the police were overwhelmed. Sightings of the Kelly gang flooded in from every corner of the colony, but nearly all were false alarms. Still, the authorities took no chances. Each report had to be investigated, draining manpower and resources. The reward for Kelly's capture soared to £1,000, and in response, the government intensified its crackdown. 58 officers were relocated to northeastern Victoria, swelling the district's police force to 217 men, while 50 soldiers were deployed to guard local banks. Despite the growing manhunt, the Kelly gang had their own network. Much of the loot from Euroa had already been distributed among family and sympathizers, leaving the gang once again in need of funds. Their next target: the bank at Jerilderie, a quiet town 65 kilometers across the New South Wales border. This time, their plan was bigger, bolder, and far more than just a robbery. It would be a statement, an act of defiance against the system that had made them outlaws. As the gang prepared to strike, their supporters moved in ahead of them, laying the groundwork, gathering intelligence, and waiting for the moment when Jerilderie would wake to find itself in the grip of Australia's most notorious outlaws. During that time, an intriguing development unfolded. In February 1879, Aaron Sherritt made his way to the Benalla police station, seeking out Captain Standish. Instead, he found himself face to face with Superintendent Francis Augustus Hare. Sherritt had urgent news. Joe Byrne and Dan Kelly had visited his selection at Woolshed Valley the day before. They had pressed him to join the gang, revealing their plan to travel to Goulburn, New South Wales, where the Kellys had a cousin. But despite their insistence, Aaron had refused. Sensing an opportunity, Superintendent Hare made Sherritt an offer to become a police informer. Tempted by the £4,000 reward for the gang's capture, Sherritt agreed. Superintendent Hare sweetened the deal further, putting him on a stipend of 7 shillings a day to feed the police information. With that handshake, Sherritt had unknowingly sealed his fate. Meanwhile, the Kelly gang was on the move. On the 7th of February, 1879, they crossed the Murray River between Mulwala and Tocumwal, camping overnight in the bush. The following day, they stopped at Mrs. Davidson's Woolpack Inn, about 3 kilometers from Jerilderie. There, they drank and mingled with patrons, gathering intelligence on the town and its police presence. Among those they spoke to was a sharp-witted barmaid, known locally as Mary the Larrikin. She had heard plenty of talk about the infamous outlaws, and unknowingly, gave them more insight into Jerilderie than she realized. Jerilderie, whose name comes from an Aboriginal word meaning reedy place, was a small settlement of about 400 people in the 1870s. Surrounded by billabongs, the town had a bank, a telegraph office, 5 hotels, a courthouse that doubled as a church, a newspaper office, and other amenities. The law in Jerilderie was upheld by just 2 policemen, Senior Constable George Devine and Probationary Constable Henry Richards. 2 men. That was all. In the early hours of the 9th of February, Senior Constable Devine and his heavily pregnant wife, Mary, were jolted awake by a commotion outside their residence. A loud voice rang through the night. "Police! Police! Get up! There's a great row at Davidson's Hotel." Davidson's was miles out of town, too far for an ordinary brawl to matter. But the desperate tone in the caller's voice suggested danger. "They are fighting out there. If it's not stopped, there'll be a murder before morning. Get up at once and bring Richards with you." Devine hurriedly pulled on his boots and opened the door, just as Constable Richards appeared from his quarters. The moment they stepped outside, the trap was sprung. A stranger pulled a revolver from his coat, his voice ringing out with deadly authority. "Throw up your hands. I am Ned Kelly." The Jerilderie Raid had begun. With the Jerilderie police barracks secured, the Kelly gang moved swiftly. They locked up Constables George Devine and Henry Richards, ensuring there would be no interference. Devine's wife and young children were also held hostage overnight, a chilling warning against any escape attempts. The following morning, Dan Kelly did the unthinkable. Dressed in a police uniform, he accompanied Mary Devine to church, assisting her in preparing the altar for Sunday service, as if nothing were amiss. Meanwhile, Joe Byrne and Steve Hart, also disguised as police officers, took Constable Richards on a tour of the town, familiarizing themselves with Jerilderie's layout and routine. By 10 a.m. on the 10th of February, Ned Kelly and Joe Byrne had fully assumed their roles as lawmen. Dressed in police uniforms, they took Richards with them into town, leaving Devine behind in the lockup and issuing a brutal warning to his wife: if she or her children tried to leave, they would be killed. With everything in place, the gang struck. Ned and Dan, still in disguise, strode into the Royal Mail Hotel, where Ned leveled his revolver at the owner, Charlie Cox. The gang swiftly took control, rounding up hostages, while Dan and Steve Hart ensured no one escaped. Meanwhile, Byrne made his move on the bank of New South Wales. Entering through the rear entrance, he was confronted by bank accountant Edward Living. With cold confidence, Byrne uttered 2 words that would have sent a chill down any spine. "I am Kelly." That was all it took. The bank staff, including Living and Clark James Mackey, were taken hostage and marched to the Royal Mail Hotel, where they joined the other captives. The gang then went for the bank manager, John Tarleton, who was caught completely off guard, mid-bath in the backroom of the bank. He was hauled out dripping wet, and the robbery continued. Ned and Byrne looted the bank, walking away with £2,141 in cash and valuables. But for Ned Kelly, this was more than just a robbery. It was a statement against the financial institutions that oppressed the poor. In a symbolic act of defiance, he set fire to bank deeds, mortgages, and securities, declaring, "The bloody banks are crushing the life's blood out of the poor, struggling man." Yet, even in this moment of destruction, Ned showed mercy. Edward Living, the accountant, pleaded for one document to be spared: his own insurance policy. Ned, true to his own peculiar sense of justice, granted the request, allowing Living's policy to remain intact. The Jerilderie Raid was in full swing. The Kelly gang had robbed a bank, humiliated the police, and taken over an entire town. But Ned wasn't finished yet. There was one more thing he had come to do: deliver his manifesto to the world. With the bank hostages now detained at the Royal Mail Hotel, the Kelly gang tightened their grip on Jerilderie. Joe Byrne stormed into the post office, smashing the telegraph equipment to sever any chance of raising the alarm. Meanwhile, Ned ordered several hostages to cut down the telegraph wires, ensuring that word of their raid would not reach the authorities before they were well out of town. Then, in a scene reminiscent of a rebel leader addressing his troops, Ned gathered his 30-odd hostages for a final lecture, a fiery condemnation of police corruption and the failings of the justice system. With his message delivered, he freed most of them, but Constable Richards and 2 telegraphists were locked in the police barracks, a calculated move to buy the gang more time. Before leaving, Ned handed the key to Mrs. Devine, issuing a firm but chilling instruction. She was to unlock the barracks only after 7 p.m., ensuring that by then, the gang would be long gone. If she complied, her husband would live. In the days that followed, Mrs. Devine would reflect on that moment, calling Ned Kelly the kindest man she had ever met. As the Kelly gang prepared to ride out, Dan Kelly and Joe Byrne made their exit first, taking the police's own horses and weapons as trophies of their triumph. But on the road, they were stopped by an unlikely figure, local Methodist minister J.B. Gribble. With moral conviction, Gribble persuaded Ned to leave behind a prized racehorse they have taken from Jerilderie, explaining that it belonged to a young lady. In an unusual display of chivalry, Ned agreed and turned back toward town. At the Albion Travelers Rest Hotel, he returned the horse, Minnie, to its rightful owner. While there, he also confronted Steve Hart, ordering him to return a stolen watch to Reverend Gribble. But Ned wouldn't leave empty-handed. Instead of Minnie's horse, he allowed Hart to take Constable Devine's iron grey steed. As Hart mounted up and bid Jerilderie farewell, Ned Kelly stood alone, the last man of the gang left in town. Rather than slipping away quietly, Ned made a final, audacious stand. He strode back into the Royal Mail Hotel, shouted the bar, and held court one last time. Raising his glass for a final toast, he placed his revolver on the counter and declared for all to hear. "There is my revolver, anyone here may take it and shoot me dead. But if I am shot, Jerilderie shall swim in its own blood." No one dared move. Ned had already won. As the Kelly gang vanished into the night, they left behind more than just empty coffers and humiliated policemen. They had stolen the very heart and soul of Jerilderie. The townspeople, rather than cheering their departure, stepped out to farewell them. Such was the support and admiration the bushranger enjoyed from sections of society who saw him not as a villain, but as a folk hero. But for the authorities, the Jerilderie Raid was nothing short of a disaster, a national embarrassment for the men in uniform. The Kelly gang had not only robbed a bank and taken over an entire town, but they had also made the law look powerless in the face of rebellion. The outlaws had disappeared into the shadows of the bush, but they would not stay hidden forever. For 17 months, they remained ghosts. But when they resurfaced, it would be for their final and most desperate stand. In Jerilderie, 2 statues stand in striking contrast, one of Sir John Monash, the brilliant civil engineer and First World War military commander, and the other of Ned Kelly, Australia's most infamous bushranger, standing beside a horse. It's a curious juxtaposition, but behind it lies a little-known tale that connects these 2 historical figures. A year before the Kelly gang's infamous raid on Jerilderie, Ned and his men visited the town on more peaceful business, trading stolen horses. During this visit, they stopped at the Monash family property, where Louis Monash, father of the future general, purchased a horse from none other than Ned Kelly himself. But the most remarkable part of the story came when a young John Monash, awestruck yet fearless, worked up the courage to approach the bushranger. According to Monash's own recollections, he and Ned chatted for a while, and before parting, Ned handed him a coin for minding his horses. It was a fleeting but unforgettable encounter, one that left an impression on the boy, who would grow up to become one of Australia's greatest wartime leaders. Today, in Jerilderie, the statues of Monash and Kelly stand near each other, a silent nod to a moment in history when their paths briefly crossed. After the Kelly gang vanished into the night, the town of Jerilderie was left in a stunned silence. But while many stood in awe of what had just unfolded, Postmaster Jefferson knew there was no time to waste. With the help of his assistant, he hurried to reconnect the severed telegraph wires, painstakingly working against the clock to restore communication. By 9 o'clock, their efforts paid off. The first urgent cable to Melbourne was successfully sent. News of the Kelly gang's audacious raid had finally reached the outside world. Before setting foot in Jerilderie, Ned Kelly had a plan that went far beyond robbing a bank. He was not just a bushranger, but a man determined to set the record straight. After his previous letter to MP Donald Cameron failed to gain traction in the newspapers, Kelly resolved to take matters into his own hands. He would write a new letter, one that would tell his side of the story, justify his actions, and expose what he saw as police corruption and oppression. This was not merely a defense, it was a declaration. In it, Kelly implored wealthy squatters to share their riches with the struggling rural poor, invoked Ireland's long history of rebellion against English rule, and threatened a grand colonial stratagem, a shocking act that would not only shake Victoria and its police force, but send shockwaves through the British Empire itself. The Jerilderie Letter, dictated by Kelly to Joe Byrne, became a 56-page handwritten document containing 7,391 words, powerful, raw, and defiant account of his life and grievances. Kelly himself described it as a bit of my life. Tasked with ensuring its publication, Kelly entrusted the letter to Edwin Living, bank accountant, instructing him to deliver it to the editor of the Jerilderie and Urana Gazette. News of the document spread quickly, and journalists from the Argus and the Age rushed to Jerilderie, offering Living money in exchange for it. But the colonial authorities moved swiftly to suppress it. The Attorney General of New South Wales issued a direct order. Under no circumstances was the letter to be published. In the end, only select excerpts, copied from a transcription made by John Hanlon, owner of the 8 Mile Hotel in Deniliquin, appeared in the press. It would take more than 50 years before the full Jerilderie Letter was rediscovered and published in 1930. The Jerilderie Raid had humiliated the police forces of 2 colonies, and the authorities were determined to bring the Kelly gang to justice, dead or alive. In response, the New South Wales government, along with several major banks, issued a staggering £4,000 reward for the gang's capture. This was the largest reward offered in the colony since £5,000 was placed on the heads of the Clark brothers in 1867. But the Victorian government went a step further, matching the offer, bringing the total reward to £8,000, the largest bounty ever placed on bushrangers in Australia. To put this into perspective, in those days, an average working man would have to toil for 200 years to earn such a fortune. Despite the increased reward, catching the gang was proving to be an impossible task. The Victorian Police Force, under Chief Commissioner Frederick Standish and Superintendent Francis Augustus Hare, continued to be bombarded with false sightings and misleading reports. Informants from their network provided a constant flow of information, but much of it was unreliable. Determined to close in on the outlaws, Superintendent Hare ramped up operations, organizing frequent search parties and maintaining round-the-clock surveillance on known Kelly sympathizers. As frustration mounted, a new strategy was considered. The newly appointed Governor of Victoria, Marquis Normanby, held a high opinion of Queensland's native police troopers, renowned for their tracking abilities. He pushed for their deployment, believing they could succeed where Victorian police had failed. In March 1879, 6 Aboriginal troopers from Queensland, led by Sub-Inspector Stanhope O'Connor, were sent to Benalla to join the hunt for the Kelly gang. Kelly himself feared their legendary tracking skills, knowing they could follow a trail long after his gang had vanished into the bush. However, Standish and Hare were skeptical, dismissing their value and temporarily withdrawing their services, a decision that would later be questioned. While the manhunt intensified, the Kelly gang remained elusive, vanishing into the Victorian wilderness. But they could not hide forever. Their 17-month disappearance would end in one final, desperate stand that would etch their names into history forever. By May 1879, frustration over the Kelly gang's continued evasion had reached its peak. In a bold move to weaken their support network, Chief Commissioner Frederick Standish advised the Victorian Land Board to blacklist 86 alleged Kelly sympathisers from purchasing land in the secluded areas of northeastern Victoria. The objective was clear: disperse the gang's network and disrupt the stock theft operations that fueled their survival. Meanwhile, the Victorian government and media were becoming increasingly critical of the police force's inability to capture the gang, particularly given the massive reward on offer. With parliamentary scrutiny mounting and pressure on Standish to deliver results, he decided on a change in leadership. On the 3rd of July, 1879, Assistant Commissioner Charles Hope Nicholson was appointed to lead operations from Benalla. However, Standish immediately undermined him, slashing police numbers, withdrawing most soldiers guarding banks, and cutting the search budget. With fewer resources at his disposal, Nicholson was forced to rely heavily on targeted surveillance, spies, and informants in an attempt to infiltrate the gang's support network. Despite his efforts, almost a year passed without success. The gang remained one step ahead, and public confidence in the police plummeted. By June 1880, Nicholson was removed from his position and replaced by Superintendent Francis Hare, marking yet another shift in strategy. As Superintendent Hare took command, the police were closer than ever to their final confrontation with the Kelly gang, but they didn't know it yet. In June 1880, police informant Daniel Kennedy reported startling intelligence. The gang was preparing for another raid, and, even more incredibly, had fashioned bulletproof armor out of agricultural equipment. Hare found the claim laughable, dismissing it as nonsense, and promptly sacked Kennedy. It was a critical mistake. Within weeks, Ned Kelly and his gang would emerge for their final stand, clad in the very armor the authorities had refused to believe existed. As the Kelly outbreak continued, the police tightened their surveillance on the gang's movements, keeping a close watch on Joe Byrne's mother's house in Woolshed Valley near Beechworth. But rather than setting up camp out in the open, they used the home of Aaron Sherritt, Byrne's former friend, as their undercover base of operations. Sherritt, once a loyal Greta mob member, had switched allegiances, accepting police payments to camp with their watch parties and report on gang activity. But not everyone in the force trusted him. Detective Michael Ward suspected that Sherritt was playing both sides, deliberately misleading the police to shield his childhood mate, Joe Byrne. In March 1879, Byrne's mother spotted Sherritt standing with a police watch party on a hilltop near her home. Her public denunciation of him as a spy left no doubt. His betrayal was now an open secret. After that, Sherritt's fate was sealed. In the months that followed, both Joe Byrne and Ned Kelly sent messages, inviting him to rejoin the gang. But when he ignored their offers and continued working with the police, they decided on a deadly course of action. His murder would be more than revenge. It would be a catalyst for a grander plan, one they boasted would astonish not only the Australian colonies, but the whole world. On the 26th of June, 1880, Dan Kelly and Joe Byrne rode into Woolshed Valley, prepared to eliminate the man they once called a friend. That evening, they kidnapped a local gardener, Anton Wick, and forced him to accompany them to Sherritt's hut. Inside, Sherritt sat unsuspectingly, in the company of his pregnant wife, Ellen, her mother, and a four-man police watch party. He had no idea that his past had finally caught up with him. The trap was set. Joe Byrne and Dan Kelly had come to Woolshed Valley that night with one goal: eliminate Aaron Sherritt. Byrne forced Anton Wick to knock on the back door of Sherritt's hut and call for him. As soon as Sherritt answered the door, Byrne fired his shotgun, hitting him in the throat and chest. Sherritt collapsed and died instantly. His past betrayal had caught up with him. With Sherritt dead, Byrne and Dan Kelly stormed into the hut. Inside, a four-man police watch party panicked, immediately hiding in one of the bedrooms. Byrne heard them scrambling for their shotguns and ordered them to come out. When they refused to respond, Byrne fired a volley of shots into the bedroom, but the terrified officers did not return fire. Growing frustrated, Byrne sent Aaron Sherritt into the bedroom to drag the police out, but instead, the officers held her inside the room with them, using her as a human shield. Realizing that the police were too scared to fight, Byrne and Dan left the hut, collected kindling, and began shouting threats to burn everyone alive. For nearly 2 hours, they taunted the officers, making it clear that their cowardice would not be forgotten. Finally, they released Wick and rode off into the night. With Sherritt dead and the police paralyzed with fear, the Kelly gang's grand plan was now in motion. The murder of Aaron Sherritt was more than an act of revenge, it was a calculated move. The Kelly gang expected the police at Woolshed Valley to immediately report the murder to Beechworth, knowing that once word got out, the authorities would respond with force. At the time, Glenrowan was little more than a railway stop in the Warby Ranges. It had a railway station, a handful of hotels, including Mrs. and Jones Glenrowan Inn, a blacksmith shop, a general store, a small collection of dwellings, a nearby quarry, where contract workers lived in tents. As they predicted, a police special train would be dispatched from Melbourne, collecting reinforcements from Benalla, before passing through Glenrowan, on its way to confront the outlaws. Knowing this, Ned Kelly forced 2 railway workers to damage the tracks at Glenrowan, preparing to derail the police train. If successful, the wreckage would kill dozens of officers, leaving the gang to finish off any survivors. In the days leading up to the siege, police intelligence was already picking up unusual activity in the area. Farmers had been reporting thefts of moldboards from their plows, but police had no idea why. Eddie Hart, sister of gang member Steve Hart, was spotted at Mrs. Jones Glenrowan Inn, a location frequented by Kelly sympathizers. Rumors swirled that Eddie Hart was Ned Kelly's sweetheart, with some even speculating that they were secretly married. Dick Hart, Steve Hart's brother, had also been seen at the hotel recently. Even the local Benalla newspaper reported on riotous behavior at the inn, adding to the growing suspicion that something was about to happen. Yet, despite these warnings, the police had no idea that Glenrowan was about to become the stage for the final, bloody confrontation between the Kelly gang and the forces of law and order. The Kelly gang's plot at Glenrowan was more than just a train derailment, it was an all-out assault on law and order. After the train crashed, they would slaughter any survivors, then ride straight to Benalla, where there were no police left to stop them. Once there, the gang planned to bomb the railway bridge over the Broken River, cutting off reinforcements. Then, in a wave of destruction, they would rob the banks, bomb the police barracks, torch the courthouse, free the prisoners from the jail and sow total chaos before disappearing back into the bush. It was an audacious, military-style operation, and if it worked, it would shake the colony to its core. The outlaws selected a deadly location to sabotage the railway line, a sharp curve at an incline where the train would be speeding at 60 miles per hour before derailing into a deep gully. To secure the area, the Kelly gang took control of key locations: Glenrowan Railway Station, the station master's home, and Jones Glenrowan Inn, directly opposite the station. They rounded up hostages, separating them by gender and age. Men were locked in the hotel, women and children were held at the station master's house. Meanwhile, McDonald's Railway Hotel was used as a makeshift stable for the gang's stolen horses, one of which carried a keg of blasting powder and fuses, ready for use. The pack horses carried the unusual cargo, 4 suits of bullet-repelling armor, made from stolen plow moldboards. Each suit weighed around 44 kilograms and covered the head, chest, and shoulders. They were designed to withstand bullets in a gunfight. This was Ned Kelly's greatest invention, a medieval-style defense for modern warfare. By the afternoon of the 27th of June, the Kelly gang was growing impatient. The train still had not arrived, and they had no way of knowing why. What they didn't realize was that the policemen stationed at Aaron Sherritt's hut had been too terrified to leave. Instead of rushing to Beechworth to report the murder, they remained holed up inside until morning, convinced that the gang was still outside waiting to kill them. It wasn't until sunrise that they finally ventured out and alerted their superiors. Meanwhile, at Glenrowan, the outlaws had taken full control of the town. They had rounded up a total of 62 hostages and confined them inside and Jones' Glenrowan Inn. Among the captives were station workers, local residents, passers-by, and even children. However, some of those inside were sympathizers, planted by the gang to maintain order and ensure no one attempted to escape or raise the alarm. As the hours passed and there was still no sign of the train, the tense atmosphere inside the hotel began to shift. What had started as a deadly hostage situation slowly morphed into an unusual social gathering. To keep their captives from panicking, and perhaps to distract themselves from their own growing uncertainty, the gang provided food, plied the hostages with alcohol, and even encouraged music, singing and dancing. Inside the inn, the mood was jovial. The hostages danced to the folk songs. Ned and Joe were singing with them and at times danced. All the while beer flowed freely, paid by the Kelly gang. A makeshift party broke out in the dimly lit confines of the inn. One hostage later recalled that Ned Kelly did not treat us badly, not at all. However, while Ned could be charismatic and even generous at times, he was still a dangerous and unpredictable man. At one point, he terrorized a young boy, threatening to shoot him on the spot, though he ultimately let him go unharmed. It was a reminder to everyone present that despite the revelry, their captors were armed and capable of unspeakable violence. As the night dragged on with no sign of the police train, Ned decided to release 21 of the hostages, selecting those he deemed the least threatening. Among those he set free was Thomas Curnow, a 25-year-old schoolteacher from Glenrowan. Curnow had been carefully observing the gang and, sensing an opportunity, worked to gain their trust. He spoke respectfully to Ned, carefully choosing his words so that he seemed sympathetic to their cause. Convinced that Curnow posed no threat, Ned allowed him and his wife to leave the inn, but not before issuing a warning: go quietly to bed and don't dream too loud. Curnow left the inn, but instead of going home, he made his way to the railway line, determined to stop the police train from plunging into the sabotaged tracks. Earlier that day, Ned and Steve Hart had forced 2 railway workers to tear up a section of the track at a dangerous incline, a spot where the train would be moving at nearly 60 miles per hour. Their plan was gruesome. If the pilot train was not running ahead of the police train, the main engine would derail at full speed, sending dozens of police officers to their deaths. Anyone who survived the wreck would be executed by the gang, who planned to storm the site in their bulletproof armor, finishing off anyone left alive. But Ned's plan had relied on one major assumption: that Sherritt's murder would be reported within hours. The unexpected delay had thrown everything off course, and the train was now arriving much later than expected. Ned still did not know that his carefully orchestrated ambush was about to be completely undone. At midday on the 27th of June, word of Sherritt's murder finally reached police headquarters. Officers at Beechworth rushed to respond, and by 9 p.m., a police special train departed Melbourne. On board were Sub-Inspector O'Connor and his 6 elite native police troopers, handpicked for their tracking and combat skills. Also on board were 4 journalists eager to report on the unfolding crisis, a full train crew, and a small but heavily armed force of police. At 1:30 a.m., the train stopped at Benalla to pick up Superintendent Hare and an additional 8 troopers, bringing the total number of men aboard to 27. Hare, an experienced but overconfident officer, was eager for a fight. He ordered a pilot engine to run ahead of the police train, an extra precaution in case the outlaws attempted an ambush. Meanwhile, just a few miles ahead, Thomas Curnow positioned himself along the railway line, his mind racing. He knew the gang was dangerous, and if he was caught, they would surely kill him. But he also knew that if he did nothing, dozens of police would die in the wreckage. Then, in the distance, he saw the faint glow of a train headlamp cutting through the darkness. The pilot engine was approaching Glenrowan. Curnow grabbed a lantern and wrapped it with a red scarf, waving it frantically as the small engine neared. The driver spotted him just in time and brought the train to a stop. Curnow ran up to the train crew, breathless and urgent, warning them that the track had been sabotaged ahead. If not for Curnow's actions, the police train would have hit the broken track at full speed, plunging into the gully and delivering Ned Kelly exactly what he wanted, a train full of dead officers. Instead, the message was quickly relayed back to the main train, and the police now knew they were heading into an ambush. The Kelly gang was waiting at Glenrowan, but now, instead of executing an ambush, they were about to be the ones under siege. Within hours, the final battle of Ned Kelly's life was about to begin. As the police approached Glenrowan Inn, the Kelly gang lay in wait, hidden in the shadows of the hotel's porch. The moment the police stepped into the moonlight, just 30 meters away, the outlaws opened fire. What followed was a storm of gunfire. In the first volley alone, about 150 shots were exchanged between the gang and the police. Bullets tore through the night air, shattering the silence and punching holes through the weatherboard walls of the inn. But then, amidst the chaos, a voice shouted out, "There are women and children inside." For a brief moment, the gunfire stopped. The police hesitated, realizing the inn was filled with hostages. But the damage had already been done. Superintendent Hare was struck in the left wrist, the pain so intense that he collapsed from blood loss. He was rushed back to Benalla for treatment, leaving his men to continue the siege without him. Inside the inn, Ned Kelly was already wounded, hit in the left hand, left arm, and right foot. Joe Byrne had taken a bullet to the calf, but continued to fight. The hostages were not spared from the bullets. 13-year-old John Jones and railway worker Martin Cherry were fatally wounded by police fire into the thin wooden walls of the hotel. Another hostage, George Metcalf, also suffered a mortal wound, though it remains unclear whether he was shot by the police or accidentally by Ned himself. Gunfire raged on through the night. Between volleys of bullets, a number of hostages managed to escape, mostly women and children, running through the darkness in fear. Ned, bleeding heavily, retreated from the battlefield, stumbling 90 meters into the bush behind the hotel. He was losing blood rapidly, and by 3:30 a.m., police searching the area found his rifle and iron skull cap. Nearby, they discovered him collapsed in the scrub. But he wasn't finished yet. The siege dragged on. The police maintained their position around the hotel, and sporadic gunfire echoed through the night. At 5:30 a.m., Joe Byrne was shot dead inside the hotel. In his final moments, he had been drinking whiskey at the bar, attempting to lift the spirits of his fellow outlaws. As the bullet struck, his glass fell from his hand, and he collapsed onto the floor, uttering one last toast, a tribute to the gang. With Byrne dead, reinforcements began arriving. More troopers from Wangaratta and Benalla joined the fight, raising the police contingent to about 40 men. Then, as dawn broke, something unbelievable happened. Out of the misty bush, Ned Kelly emerged. Clad in his iron armor, staggering under its weight, he walked towards the police. For a moment, the officers froze. In the early morning light, through the fog and smoke, the bizarre, helmeted figure looked like something from another world. Some thought he was a ghost. Others swore he was the devil himself. One officer whispered, "It's a bunyip." But this was no spectre. It was Ned Kelly, coming back for one final fight. He opened fire, his 3 handguns blazing, but the weight of his armor and his injuries made aiming difficult. With each bullet striking his metal plates, he later described the impact as feeling like blows from a man's fist. Staggering forward, moving from tree to tree, he fought alone. The final battle of the Kelly gang had begun. The helmeted figure, withstanding bullet after bullet, refused to fall. In the dim, misty light, the confusion turned to fear. Journalist Tom Carrington, watching in astonishment, later wrote, "With the steam rising from the ground, it looked for all the world like the ghost of Hamlet's father, with no head, only a very long thick neck. It was the most extraordinary sight I ever saw or read of in my life, and I felt fairly spellbound with wonder. I could not stir or speak. The gun battle raged for 15 minutes. Ned, bleeding and exhausted, continued to fire his pistols, moving from tree to tree, staggering under the weight of his iron armor. Inside the hotel, Dan Kelly and Steve Hart provided covering fire, blasting their rifles at the police to buy Ned time. But then, Sergeant Steele took aim. With 2 close-range shotgun blasts, he struck Ned's unprotected legs and thighs. The armored outlaw crumpled to the ground. The police swarmed him, tearing away his bullet-riddled helmet and breastplate, finally revealing the man beneath the legend. Ned Kelly, Australia's most notorious outlaw, had been captured. He was disarmed, bleeding profusely, and barely conscious. The police hauled him to the railway station, where a doctor was waiting. Upon examination, Kelly was found to have 28 wounds, including severe gunshot injuries to his left elbow and right foot. His iron armor had absorbed at least 18 bullets, including 5 to the helmet. With Ned out of the fight, attention turned back to the hotel. The siege continued. For hours, the police maintained their positions, waiting for Dan Kelly and Steve Hart to surrender. By 10 a.m., a temporary ceasefire was called, and the remaining 30 hostages were allowed to leave the hotel. As they emerged, police ordered them to lie on the ground, carefully searching for any remaining outlaws hiding among them. 2 of the hostages were arrested, both known Kelly sympathizers. But inside the hotel, Dan Kelly and Steve Hart refused to come out. By the afternoon of the 28th of June, Glenrowan had become a spectacle. Nearly 600 spectators had gathered near the site of the siege, eager to witness the final moments of the Kelly gang. Inside the Glenrowan Inn, Dan Kelly and Steve Hart had gone silent, their guns no longer firing. Superintendent Sadleir, now in command, faced a decision. He refused to order a direct assault on the hotel, fearing that the outlaws might still be armed and waiting in ambush. Instead, he requested a cannon from Melbourne, intending to blast them out. But when no artillery arrived, he chose a more brutal alternative: he would burn them out. At 2:50 p.m., under the cover of police gunfire, Senior Constable Charles Johnson made his way to the hotel. He reached the outer wall, struck a match, and set Glenrowan in a blaze. As flames engulfed the building, a Catholic priest, Father Matthew Gibney, passed through the area. Seeing the chaos before him, he halted his travels and administered the last rites to the wounded Ned Kelly, before doing something that stunned everyone. Ignoring the danger, Gibney ran into the burning hotel, determined to rescue anyone who might still be alive. Inside, he found only the dead. The body of Joe Byrne lay motionless on the ground, where he had fallen after being shot while drinking at the bar. Further inside, he discovered Dan Kelly and Steve Hart. Their charred remains lay together, though exactly how they died remains a mystery. Some believed they took their own lives rather than be captured, while others suspected they were killed in the fire or fatally wounded by police bullets before the flames consumed the hotel. As the fire raged on, police managed to pull Byrne's body from the ruins. They also rescued Martin Cherry, a mortally wounded hostage, though he succumbed to his injuries soon after. By 4 p.m., the fire had reduced Glenrowan into ashes. When the smoldering ruins cooled, the police recovered the remains of Dan Kelly and Steve Hart, burned beyond recognition. Other casualties of the siege included Michael Reardon and his baby sister Bridget, both hostages wounded by stray bullets. An Aboriginal trooper, Jimmy, was also shot. The owner of the inn, and Jones, was supporting the Kelly gang, controlling the hostages and providing food and entertainment. She lost her son, John Jones, in the siege. Jane Jones, the sister of young John Jones, was struck in the head by a stray bullet. She survived the initial wound, but 2 years later, she died from a lung infection, which her mother and Jones believed was a direct result of her injury. With the Kelly gang destroyed, the aftermath of the siege began. Ned Kelly, though riddled with bullet wounds, was still alive. He was transported to Benalla, where doctors examined him and determined that his injuries were not fatal. His iron armor may not have saved him from capture, but it had kept him alive. Outside the lockup where Kelly was held, Joe Byrne's body was strung up and photographed. Casts were taken of his head and limbs, later used to create waxwork models that were exhibited in Melbourne. When Byrne's sympathizers requested his body, the police denied them, instead holding a hasty inquest and burying him in an unmarked grave in Benalla Cemetery. Dan Kelly and Steve Hart's burned remains were collected by their families and laid to rest in unmarked graves at Greta Cemetery. As for Ned Kelly, he was transported to Melbourne Jail Hospital, where he recuperated from his injuries. 4 weeks after his capture, the Victorian government arranged for his transfer to Beechworth, where he would face trial. The Glenrowan siege was over. The Kelly gang was no more. But for Ned Kelly, the final chapter of his life was only just beginning. Ned Kelly's committal hearing took place at Beechworth Court in August 1880. His lawyer, Member of Parliament, David Gaunson, took on the case, though he would later admit that he questioned Kelly's mental stability. He found his client incapable of justifying the killings of police officers, especially when Kelly likened them to soldiers, an argument that failed to impress the court. Gaunson knew that a guilty verdict was inevitable, so he shifted focus to Kelly's claim of police persecution, arguing that constant harassment had driven him to become a bushranger. He even arranged for Kelly's words to be paraphrased and published in The Age, attempting to rally public support. Despite these efforts, Kelly was committed for trial, charged with the murders of Constables Lonergan and Scanlon. Initially, the trial was set to be held in Beechworth, but authorities feared that Kelly sympathizers would intimidate the jury. To prevent interference, the case was moved to the Central Criminal Court in Melbourne. Beechworth, a historic town in Victoria, was a thriving centre of activity in the 1870s, shaped by the gold rush that had begun in the 1850s. Once one of the richest goldfields in Australia, Beechworth attracted thousands of fortune seekers, transforming it into a prosperous settlement with grand public buildings, bustling streets, and a strong police and judicial presence. By the 1870s, the initial gold boom had slowed, but the town remained an important hub for commerce and law enforcement in northeast Victoria. It was during this time that Beechworth became deeply connected to the Kelly gang and their story. The Beechworth Courthouse was the site of key trials involving Ned Kelly and his family, while Beechworth Jail held various members of the Kelly family and their associates, who collectively served over 40 years behind its walls. Ned Kelly himself appeared at the courthouse in 1880 before being sent to Melbourne for his final trial. Today, Beechworth's well-preserved streets and historic sites offer a vivid reminder of its gold rush past and its enduring connection to Australia's most infamous bushranger. Kelly's trial began on the 19th of October, 1880, presided over by Judge Sir Redmond Barry, the very same judge who had sentenced Kelly's mother to prison following the Fitzpatrick incident. Kelly's defence team was inexperienced. His novice barrister, Henry Bindon, struggled against the well-prepared prosecution, while Gaunson served as counsel. Kelly family could not afford good and experienced barristers. The trial was briefly adjourned until the 28th of October, and when proceedings resumed, the prosecution decided to pursue only the charge of Lonergan's murder. The verdict was swift, guilty. Judge Barry sentenced Kelly to death by hanging. As he delivered the customary words, "May God have mercy on your soul," Kelly, ever defiant, stared straight at him and replied, "I will go a little further than that, and say I will see you there where I go." 12 days after Kelly's execution, Barry died of natural causes, a coincidence that some of Kelly's supporters would later call supernatural justice. On the 3rd of November, the Executive Council of Victoria confirmed that Kelly's execution was set for the 11th of November, to be carried out at Melbourne Jail. The news sparked public outrage. In Melbourne, thousands of people took to the streets, demanding a reprieve for Kelly. A petition for clemency gathered over 32,000 signatures, but it was swiftly rejected. The press ridiculed the protests, calling them inflammatory, seditious, and plainly useless. Some journalists warned that Victoria was on the brink of a social revolt, where class would rise against class. Fearing an uprising, police reinforced security around Melbourne jail, deploying extra troopers to government buildings in case of a mob attack. But nothing would stop what was coming. Ned Kelly's fate was sealed. His final days had begun. The day before his execution, Ned Kelly posed for a final photograph, a keepsake for his family, capturing the face of Australia's most infamous outlaw in his last moments. He was also granted farewell meetings with relatives, a brief moment of solace before his fate was sealed. One newspaper reported that his mother's last words to him were, "Mind you die like a Kelly." However, some historians have questioned whether she truly said this or if it was simply a piece of folklore woven into the legend. Elijah Upjohn, the hangman who executed Ned Kelly in 1880, was a 58-year-old ex-convict with a long history of petty crimes and run-ins with the law. His troubled past began at the age of 11, when he was convicted of stealing a pair of trousers and sentenced to 3 months imprisonment, along with 2 private whippings. In 1839, he was sentenced to 7 years transportation to Van Diemen's Land for stealing shoes, gaining his freedom in 1846. However, he continued to appear in court for minor offences over the years. By 1880, he was back in Melbourne jail, serving time for selling fake medicines and stealing chickens. When bailiffs sought a volunteer to carry out Ned Kelly's execution, only Upjohn stepped forward, securing his place in history as the man who ended the life of Australia's most infamous bushranger. On the morning of the 11th of November, 1880, Kelly prayed, preparing himself for what was to come. As he passed the jail's garden on his way to the gallows, he paused to admire the flowers, remarking on their beauty, but otherwise said very little. At 10 a.m., Ned Kelly was hanged at Melbourne jail. His last words remain a point of debate. Some newspapers reported his final remark as "such is life." Others claimed he muttered, "Ah, well, I suppose it has come to this," though some believe this was merely an interpretation rather than a direct quote. A policeman present at the execution later stated that, just before the cap was drawn over Kelly's head, he glanced up at the skylight and whispered something indiscernible. Whether his last words were spoken, misheard, or lost to history, the man who had defied the law for so long was finally gone. But Kelly's legacy did not die with him. In March 1881, the Victorian government launched a royal commission into the conduct of the Victorian police during the Kelly outbreak. Chaired by Francis Longmore, the commission spent 6 months investigating the actions of the police, holding 66 meetings, examining 62 witnesses, and travelling throughout Kelly country to hear first-hand accounts. While the final report did not exonerate Kelly or his gang, it did uncover widespread corruption within the police force, leading to severe consequences for many officers. Chief Commissioner Frederick Standish, one of Kelly's most determined pursuers, was forced to resign in disgrace. Many other officers were censured, demoted, suspended, or dismissed for their failures during the Kelly hunt. The commission concluded with 36 recommendations for reform, stripping the authorities of what little reputation they had left after the Kelly outbreak. Kelly had once hoped that his death would lead to an inquiry into police misconduct. While the commission did not justify his actions, it did expose the deep flaws in the very system that had hunted him down. Following the death of Ned Kelly, the £8,000 reward, the largest ever offered for bushrangers, was divided among various claimants. The bulk of the money, £6,000, went to members of the Victorian Police, with Superintendent Hare receiving the largest share, at £800. However, not everyone was satisfied. Thomas Curnow, the school teacher, who had saved the police train at Glenrowan, was originally awarded £550, but after he protested the unfair split, his share was increased to £1,000. The 7 Aboriginal trackers, whose skills in bushcraft had played a crucial role in the Kelly pursuit, were each awarded £50. But in a shameful twist, the Victorian and Queensland governments refused to hand over the money. Instead, they kept the funds, citing the patronising excuse that it would not be desirable to place any considerable sum of money in the hands of persons unable to use it. But while the legend of Ned Kelly lives on, his physical remains have had a journey of their own, one filled with controversy, mystery, and an incredible discovery. Later this year, we will bring you the final chapter, What Happened to Remains of the Kelly Gang. Stay tuned.